Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Egan. I'll be speaking today about the life of Mrs. Carnis Salisbury, Albuquerque fair housing and civil rights pioneer for the Albuquerque Historical Society. Again, this is a presentation on the life of Mrs. Carnis Hightower Salisbury, an Albuquerque fair housing and civil rights pioneer. And this presentation is being made today on Sunday, June 20th, 2021, to the Albuquerque Historical Society. The mission of the Historical Society is promoting and preserving all matters relating to the history of Albuquerque. Traditionally, Albuquerque Historical Society meets once a month on Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock in the Albuquerque Museum of Art and History in person, inside the History Museum in Old Town, located at 2000 Mountain Road Northwest. However, because of the COVID-19 pandemic that broke out in 2020 and is continuing into 2021, meetings are being held remotely online using web broadcasting and video conferencing. The Historical Society will eventually go back to meeting in person. Please visit the website, www.albuqhistosoc.org, the Albuquerque Historical Society website, for more information about Albuquerque Historical Society, and including links to lots of historic records and other teaching materials. This presentation is also being recorded for viewing in the future for free, video on demand. So if you're a teacher and you'd like to present this in a class, you can show this in the future. For today's live presentation, we'll be taking questions online that I'll be able to answer at the end of the presentation. If you're watching this presentation after the live presentation on June 20th, feel free to write to me at the Housing Authority or give me a call at the Housing Authority office. Thank you. I'm Mr. Brian Egan. I'm the presenter today. I work as an attorney at Albuquerque Housing Authority. I was born and raised here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I graduated from the University of New Mexico School of Law in 2006 with my Juris Doctorate degree, and I've been working for the Housing Authority since then. Of course, as any good lawyer would tell you, I have a disclaimer. Any opinions expressed are my own and not necessarily government policy or the views of Albuquerque Housing Authority or the City of Albuquerque or the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development or any other government agency. And Albuquerque Housing Authority is my client as a government employee. I'm not here to provide any direct private legal advice to individual persons, because we will be talking about fair housing law and city ordinances today. Now, the learning objectives for today's presentation. I want you all to learn when Carnis Salisbury lived and died and where Carnis Salisbury lived during those time periods. What she experienced while living in Albuquerque for 50 years, from 1961 to 2011. And her husband also, Oliver, and Salisbury, and what they experienced as a married couple, as a family. How she worked to overcome racial discrimination in housing opportunities and in employment opportunities throughout her life as a team with other persons. How she helped improve Albuquerque and the state of New Mexico more broadly, and even the United States of America, our whole nation. She was part of a team effort that led to positive changes in our society. I want you to learn who she worked with, her family members, and some of her major influences. Let's start with the beginning of her life. She was born in Texas under the name Miss Carnis Hightower, born January 1st, 1914. Her father was the Reverend William Henry Hightower, a minister in the Methodist Church, which in 2021 is called the United Methodist Church, the UMC. Her mother, Miss Bertha Blewett Hightower, was a graduate of Prairie View Agricultural Mechanical College in Texas. Her childhood was spent in Caldwell, Texas. Carnis grew up in Caldwell, Texas, as the great-grandchild of Southern slaves. She had multiple sisters and brothers, so she was in a big family. She was definitely not an only child. And the trend in her family was that they would all go to college, and which is definitely not the norm for African Americans living in small-town Texas in that generation. Both her parents were college graduates as well. She lived in a strong, close-knit family with strong support for higher education. And this would take her many places throughout her life and help her have a big impact on many other people. Here's a Hightower family photo of the kids in Texas. This is also a photo that was showed at her memorial service, and we'll see that again later in the presentation. Her parents conveyed strong, deep values to Carnis that she would hold her whole life: to value education and to seek to achieve higher education in college and graduate school, to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with the Lord, to love all people. Carnis, as the elder daughter, had a leadership role in her father's church, a congregation of the Methodist Church, as a child and as a youth. She was a preacher's kid, as some might say. She was training to lead others forward. She was a community organizer, even as a child and as a teenager. Carnis quoted her father, the Reverend William Hightower, saying, this was the father's message to his kids: "The only way you can survive is in realizing that color does not determine who you are." This quote was provided by Mrs. Salisbury to reporter Carrie Sealdman when she was being interviewed by the Albuquerque Journal in a profile published in Sage magazine in January 1999. And I'd like to recognize that today, June 20th, 2021, is Father's Day. And fathers have a major impact on the lives of their children. And Carnis benefited from having a trustworthy, strong father that guided her through her whole childhood and inspired her for her whole life, even after he was gone. Carnis's personality was that she was a brave woman. She was willing to try new things. She did not give up on achieving her goals in life. She was willing to move to new cities, in new states, to try new things, take new jobs, leave friends and family and familiarity behind. And not everyone can do that. She worked to improve the city that she lived in, the state that she lived in, and the nation as a whole. She learned new skills throughout her life, never stopped learning. She was a lifelong learner. She was a college graduate. She completed seminary, as we'll see, and more. She was an effective community organizer, an effective advocate for civil rights and equality for all people. She used nonviolent means in her method of activism, there were people that pursued other methods during the 20th century. So she made the choice to go down the nonviolent path during the civil rights movement. Now, a bit about her college years. Carnis enrolled in Wiley College in Marshall, Texas, which is an historically Black college or university, an HBCU, as we would say in the 21st century. Wiley College was a private school. It was founded in 1873 by the Freedmen Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church to provide educational opportunities to African Americans so they could join professions and move up in the world. Carnis would remain a member of the Methodist Church her entire life. Her father gave her that strong foundation. Reverend Hightower was a Methodist minister. Carnis went to a Methodist college. She would remain affiliated with as a member of the United Methodist Church for her entire life, all the way to Trinity UMC at the end, here in Albuquerque. While at Wiley College, Carnis connected with students and faculty. It was a small college in a small town, so everybody got to know everybody. And they all supported efforts for social justice. So she made important connections that would serve her well going forward. She was on campus in the same era as the famous, nationally successful Wiley College debate team of 1935 that was immortalized in the movie The Great Debaters by Denzel Washington. So if you want to get a flavor of what it was like for Carnis to go to school at Wiley College, please watch that movie. She then graduates from Wiley College with a bachelor's degree. And here's a photo of Carnis Hightower, a young woman, not yet Mrs. Salisbury. She had, as an elementary school, and what does Carnis decide to do after graduating with her bachelor's degree? Her first job after college? Become an elementary school teacher. She teaches 5th and 7th grade in Pittsburgh, Texas. But she craves more in life than just being a small town school teacher. She decides to apply for admission to graduate school out of state. She's willing to take a risk, try something new, move out of Texas, where she's spent her whole life, to live in Atlanta, Georgia, as a single woman. So she moves across the country to pursue theological studies at Gammon Theological Seminary, which is also an historically Black college or university. And she's breaking ground as one of the first women to be admitted to graduate school, because at that time, it wasn't common for women to be preachers. It's still controversial to this day in some branches of Christianity about whether women should be ordained as preachers. But in the Methodist tradition, it was not that unusual. At this point now in 2021, the United Methodist Church has been ordaining women for more than 50 years. So in her faith tradition of the Protestant branch of Christianity, that door was open. She earns a master's degree in religious education at Gammon Theological Seminary. Again, she loves to learn, she loves to teach, and she returns to teach at the college level at Wiley College back in Marshall, Texas. So she didn't forget her roots. She went back to where she had gone to undergrad. She served as Dean of Women when Jackie Robinson was Dean of Men at that college before he left for his baseball career. She was also a counselor for students. She enjoyed counseling people, putting them on the right path, helping them succeed in life. And then she meets the love of her life, Mr. Oliver Salisbury. I've been told this occurred while she was doing some work in Tuskegee, Alabama. Carnis and Oliver marry in 1942. Oliver is serving in the U.S. Army in World War II because the U.S. got involved in World War II right at the end of December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. So World War II is going on, and all men of military age are being shipped off. And so Oliver reaches the rank of first lieutenant serving in the United States Army in World War II. He has an overseas deployment. And because of his honorable service in the U.S. Army, he'll have the GI Bill of Rights benefits when he finishes his term in the Army. That will lead to healthcare opportunities and healthcare benefits with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Opportunity for college student aid. He goes to Howard University in Washington, D.C. and earns his bachelor's degree there in social work. The opportunity to get a VA home loan to buy a house. Also the right to burial in a national cemetery, which will be where he'll end up at the end in Santa Fe National Cemetery. Here's a photo of Mr. Oliver and Mrs. Carnis Salisbury. I believe this is their wedding photo based on the flowers on her lapel. This photo is provided by the Salisbury family during the funeral held at Trinity UMC for Carnis. Now, working and living in Washington, D.C. So Oliver and Carnis moved to Washington, D.C. in the 1940s. They're both employed by the U.S. government at the Department of State as researchers. Mr. Oliver Salisbury speaks Russian, which would be a very useful skill, being that the Russians were our allies in World War II, and then our adversaries during the Cold War that breaks out shortly thereafter. Remember, the Korean War also occurs in the 1950s. Carnis is becoming a mother in Washington, D.C. Her daughters, Olivia and Patricia Salisbury, are born in Washington, D.C., District of Columbia. And they're raised there. Their elementary school years are there. The Salisbury family is living in an integrated neighborhood in the District of Columbia in the 1950s. African Americans are moving to the District of Columbia from all over the nation since the Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president in the 30s, and the federal government started to grow in size, and the population of the District of Columbia started to grow in size, and people moved there to work for the federal government. Then World War II came along, and the Pentagon is built on the other side of the Potomac, and the federal government goes even bigger because of the war effort. And District of Columbia's population continues to grow, and people are moving from the South and all over the country to come work for the federal government in the defense industry and in federal agencies. And so the District of Columbia at that point in the 1950s had a majority Black population. And so the Salisbury family lived in a nice, safe, middle-class home in an integrated neighborhood in DC. Redlining had already become less common in the District of Columbia. There was more integration between people of different racial backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds. Also keeping in mind, the Reverend William Hightower, Carnis Salisbury's father, dies in 1951. So that's, that legacy continues to live on in her even after her father is gone, that strong faith that her father planted in her heart. Now, by the end of the 50s, Oliver Salisbury, Mrs. Salisbury's husband, is getting very sick from smoking tobacco, I understand. The U.S. Army in World War II gave soldiers cigarettes. That might have something to do with that. Traditionally in World War II, there would be rations of food, water, clothing, ammunition, and cigarettes for all the soldiers. So there was smoking in the Army was very common, and that may have led to Oliver's asthma problem. So he's developing a severe asthma problem living out in the District of Columbia, which is a very cold and wet winter. It's a very wet climate. And the doctors at the Veterans Affairs hospitals in DC said that Oliver wouldn't make it through another winter there. He needed to move out. It was very severe, his health problems, and he needed a big change. So they suggested moving to New Mexico, which had warmer winters and much drier air, this being the high desert. And this is common for many persons moving to New Mexico and moving to Albuquerque specifically throughout the 20th century. As you may remember from your other studies of Albuquerque history, many people moved to New Mexico in the first part of the 20th century to recover from tuberculosis. So over many decades, Albuquerque had built up a system of sanatoriums, later hospitals, that had specialty care in treating respiratory diseases because of the wave of tuberculosis patients that came here. And Oliver is following a similar path. They're chasing the cure. They're moving out to the dry, sunny state of New Mexico to recover from health problems related to the lungs. So I wasn't surprised when I learned that Oliver was moving here for his health, because thousands of other people had moved to Albuquerque throughout that century for the very same reason. Presbyterian Hospital, in fact, got started as a tuberculosis sanitarium. And most of the major hospitals in Albuquerque did as well. So moving to New Mexico, Albuquerque's in for a big change from Washington, D.C. for the Salisbury family. Because remember, in the 60s, well, in the 50s, they'd been living in Albuquerque. In the 1950s, Carnis and Oliver Salisbury had been living in D.C., a majority African-American city, in a mixed neighborhood, non-segregated area. When they get to Albuquerque in 61, it's a much smaller city compared to urban DC. There was a culture shock. In 1961, Albuquerque had approximately 250,000 people living in it, and it was growing rapidly, but it was still a small town compared to the District of Columbia metropolitan area around the capital, which had 1.8 million people at that point. African Americans were the largest ethnic group in DC when they left the city in 1961. And when they got to Albuquerque, they were a very small group. And so they had to get used to that. And now we're setting up the stage of looking for a place to live. And first we should define what I mean by the concept of fair housing. Fair housing means that people have the freedom to choose where to live, that there are options for living, which house to rent, which apartment to rent, which place to buy, mobile home or whatever. Options for living are limited only by the ability of the person to pay rent or mortgage. And they are not limited by being part of a protected class of people, by being African American or white or Native American or Hispanic or other, color or disability or religion. People should be able to buy where they want to buy a house. People are free from legal discrimination in their residence. That's the goal of the fair housing law, that it's fair. If you can afford it, you can buy it. And so Oliver Salisbury and Carnis Salisbury struggle to find a place to live in the early 60s in Albuquerque. Oliver Salisbury is searching Albuquerque for a suitable home for sale in 1961. He's rejected a lot as a home buyer. He gets rejected multiple times because he's Black. He has plenty of money. He has thousands of dollars ready to go. Plus he has a salary of thousands of dollars ready to go. He's employed, and so will Carnis be. They have two sources of income. And they shouldn't be rejected from buying a home on the growing east side. There's more than 1,000 units for sale in Albuquerque at this point. However, the scourge of redlining still is going on at this time. Redlining is the concept that comes from maps that would be painted with big red boxes around areas where a homeowner's insurance company would not provide insurance, or a bank would not provide mortgage loans. The red zones, their high risk was the classification. And so redlining would prohibit African Americans from being able to move into neighborhoods because nobody would sell to them under the racially restrictive covenants. They couldn't get a loan in certain areas. And historically, at this point in 1961 in Albuquerque, the old South Broadway neighborhood, Broadway Boulevard Southeast, south of Cole Avenue, essentially south of the city limits, was the original historically African American area for Albuquerque. And then the Kirtland addition, which is the neighborhood south of Gibson Boulevard, east of I-25, and west of Yale, essentially, near the airport, near Cohen Air Force Base. Those were the two areas that African Americans were welcome to buy a house or rent a house, but the other parts of Albuquerque were somewhat off limit. And those limits were enshrined in law in the form of restrictive covenants of a homeowners association, where the restrictive covenants would say people that buy land in, name of subdivision on East Mesa, for example, would not be allowed to build 3-story houses, engage in oil drilling, have poultry, or sell to African Americans. However, they could have African Americans living in the house of a white homeowner if they were the domestic servant, as for example, a live-in maid or a live-in nanny. So the homeowners association's restrictive covenants prohibited African Americans like Oliver Salisbury and Carnis Salisbury from buying, because it would be a violation of the covenants to sell to them. But the Salisburys weren't giving up. They wanted a nice new home in Albuquerque, just like they had in DC in the 50s. They'd gotten used to a certain standard of living. It would seem normal to them that you could live in an integrated neighborhood. Eventually, Oliver Salisbury convinced a UNM professor that was selling his home by owner, for sale by owner, rather than through a real estate broker on the multiple listing service, to sell him the house at 924 Manzano Street, Northeast Albuquerque, which is near Lomas Boulevard and San Mateo. Oliver had a $10,000 down payment and a $13,000 a year salary, so he could certainly afford the mortgage. And the situation was much like the movie that came out in 1961, A Raisin in the Sun. So if you'd like to see a dramatic version of this sort of situation, please check out that movie, which is set in Chicago. Just like in Chicago, in Albuquerque, a committee of unhappy white neighbors came to the house in 1961 to offer Oliver Salisbury the price of the house, to buy him out so he would not move in. And there was a fear at that time in 1961, a fear amongst the white residents of Albuquerque, at least some of them that lived near him on Manzano Street, that their property values would go down if the Salisburys, an African-American family, moved in next door as the first Black residents of the block on the street. And Mr. Salisbury's response, according to his daughter Patricia, is classic. He said, well, I don't want my property value to go down either. So he promised that he'd be a good neighbor. And he was. Now, that experience was shared in public when Oliver Salisbury, with help from Carnis Salisbury, spoke to the City Commission in 1963 as part of a campaign that the Salisburys had organized. Oliver and Carnis Salisbury worked together to convince the Albuquerque City Commission to take action to adopt a law to ban discrimination in the sale and rental of housing inside city limits on the basis of race. And these are newspaper clippings that Carnis provided to me and other people that took her class, that you'll learn more about later in this presentation. She taught a fair housing law class for lawyers like me. And here's a picture from the Albuquerque Journal, as provided through the City Human Rights Office, that Oliver Salisbury is testifying to the City Commission at City Hall, saying discrimination does exist in Albuquerque. There's no denying it. He meets all the qualifications for buying a house except for his race. And he urged the commission to pass an ordinance prohibiting housing discrimination, which was very controversial at the time. There was an effort to stop this because people weren't necessarily comfortable with it. However, it does eventually pass. And now we're going to see a video clip here of Carnis Salisbury. It's actually two parts, part one and part two. She's speaking on April 13th, 2009, to a class on fair housing law for local attorneys put on by the City of Albuquerque Human Rights Office, which is now called the Office of Equity and Inclusion and the Office of Civil Rights. I actually attended this class. And so we're going to hear Mrs. Salisbury. And if you have difficulty hearing her, crank up the volume. And also there are closed captions as well if you have difficulty understanding what she's saying. And we'll watch the two clips here. So you can hear Mrs. Salisbury tell her the story in her own words. There are more details.
And a lot of the things that will happen not only in Albuquerque, but all over the country. The federal government has said to government agencies, you've got to have at least one that has skin like men's. Well, this was a big thing. And so they got ready, and Albuquerque got ready to find a place for this one individual to live. If the government's going to bring a minority in here, he's got to have a house, got to have somewhere to stay. Well, Albuquerque was very fortunate because at this time, Albuquerque had one woman who, as a volunteer, said, I'll find a place for him to stay. And I want to knock this. basic needs. And so this good woman offered her services to go out and find a place for that person to live. How did she do this? She went to her friends and neighbors and said, the federal government is bringing in a black person to work, and we need a place for them to live. Well, I believe that this time in 1961, there were two areas in Albuquerque that everybody felt very, blacks felt very safe in, and realtors and builders were saying, oh yes, we have a place where you can live. I won't name these communities, but some of you know where they were. And so this good woman who had volunteered her service took the person into that neighborhood and found a place for them to live. But as the problem grew and more minorities were coming into Albuquerque because the federal government has opened the door and said we have employment, then the place got a little crowded. And this one woman was not able to handle all the problems that came up. She had gone to her friends, to the churches, to see what could be done, but we were coming in pretty fast on them, and so we needed something more. As I remember, there were about 27 organizations in Albuquerque who joined forces at this time. In fact, they organized a group to work on this problem. Organizations like the NAACP, LULAC, Civil Liberties. And at this point, somebody was smart enough to say, you know, this isn't working very well. We need something that is mandatory, that says this won't happen to people who are qualified to live where they want to live and have the money to pay for a house. Something else needs to be done. And when I came here in 1961, and I tell you, my husband and I had worked hard for the little money that we had. And somehow it just didn't seem right to me to go to another individual and say, you take my money and find a house and pay for it and let me come in and live. That seemed to me, and I still don't want to knock that because it was a good service in 1961. Albuquerque needed something that was mandatory, that said this type of practice is unlawful, it's immoral, it's ungodly. And so we had to do something. And let me back up some. In 1961, we didn't have a mayor. There was a group of commissioners. The problem in housing had gotten so, I say, severe, that somehow it got on the agenda for these commissioners. We need to talk about getting fair housing in Albuquerque. And a few of us got together and somehow got it on the agenda. And the commissioners were to take up the problem of fair housing in Albuquerque. discussed. They thought, looked at all issues, and the commissioners were about to say, let's table it until the next time. We don't think we need to take it up now. Well, I still remember how my husband was a very humble man who didn't stand out to make speeches. But when the commissioner said we're going to table it, he said, wait a minute, I've got something I've got to say. And he stood up and looked at the commissioners and looked at the home builders and realtors. He said, all of you good gentlemen know me because I've been to you asking you to show me a place that was for sale that I could buy. I already knew where the houses were. I looked them up in the newspaper, and I'd been there. And I'd been told by neighbors and even church people who said, oh, I don't think the people here would like me to sell my house to you. I don't think they'd like to live next door to you. So my husband said, Albuquerque has a serious problem, and we can't afford to keep denying. We need a law that makes it mandatory for fair housing. And the commissioner said that night, we don't want to hear anything else. It's past. This was a great moment for me, and I like to remember it. But I don't want to leave here letting you believe that all the problems have been solved. We still have some people who are not able, even when they have the money and a good character, they can't go in and buy the home that they're able to pay for. And so I ask your help and understanding, for when you know the problem, I trust that you will find a way to do something about it. And so don't allow the loopholes that are there to be used. What are some of the loopholes? A high interest rate for some people. Well, I see that my time is up, but I ask your help in studying and knowing what the problem really is and doing what you can about it. And I trust that this wonderful city that we live in, that it will offer equal opportunity to all of its citizens. Let's put our shoulder to it and see that there are no loopholes, that we are standing up to the task before us. And I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to say something that is on my soul. You know, I spend a lot of time talking to my cat and my plants.
And so the Salisburys were able to buy the house, 924 Manzano Street Northeast, and they were able to get the city of Albuquerque City Commission to pass the groundbreaking Civil Rights Ordinance. We were the third city in the nation to do this. New York City, then Toledo, Ohio, then Albuquerque, New Mexico. And this happened years before the federal government decided to take action by adopting a nationwide fair housing law, the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. Now, moving to Albuquerque brought changes for Carnis Salisbury's daughter. For example, Patricia Salisbury had to change high schools. She had grown up in the District of Columbia, and now she's going to be enrolling in Highland High School, having moved to Albuquerque. That new home address in Albuquerque, a nice new house in the growing East Mesa area, meant she got to go to the newest high school in Albuquerque, the nicest public high school in Albuquerque at that time, Highland High School, which had opened in 1949, the city's second high school, because the community had grown to the point where we were no longer a small town where everyone would go to the same high school. And at that point in the 60s, she was one of just 2 African-American students that were members of the Highland High School class of 1964. So it was a big change from living in the District of Columbia, where African-Americans were the majority of the population. Her family was able to buy that new home and send her to the nice new high school because of fair housing opportunities. And again, the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's been more than 50 years now since our nation committed itself to making sure that people of all backgrounds have opportunities to buy houses and rent apartments wherever they would like, as much as their income will allow them. The Federal Fair Housing Law of 1968 protects people all across the country and prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, what country are you from, if you're from the United States or from someplace else, religion, sex, which also includes gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, mental or physical, and family status, familial status, the presence of minor children in the household, or being pregnant. You can't refuse to sell a house to someone because they have kids, or refuse to rent an apartment to someone because they're pregnant or they have children. Unless you're a specially designated elder housing complex for like people 62 plus. But in general, if you're just buying and selling single family detached houses, you can't refuse to sell to someone because they have kids, like Patricia. Now, Carnis Salisbury also was an advocate for equal employment opportunities for all Americans. She worked at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as an equal employment specialist starting in 1971. She worked as a conciliator. People would file EEOC complaints saying that someone was fired because of their race, or maybe refused to be hired because of their religion, or what have you. And she would investigate cases about race, color, religion, sex, gender, national origin, and see if there was truth to that or not, and then present her report to the employer and the person that made the complaint, the employee, and say, let's see if we can work this out. Maybe you do get the promotion after all. Maybe they will hire you, or maybe it had nothing to do with it because you didn't meet the criteria. You applied for a job as a driver, but you don't have a driver's license or something, So she worked to make sure that everyone was treated fairly and everyone had equal employment opportunities all across New Mexico and really all across the nation. She was so good at what she did, she was eventually appointed by the federal government to serve on the national board of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. She was also appointed by the governor to serve on the state's Human Rights Board. And again, this is another clipping that Carnis brought with her to that fair housing law class. She'd been profiled in the Albuquerque Journal about her job as an equal opportunity at the EEOC. And she was interviewed and mentioned that she wanted to stress education. Because remember, she was an elementary school teacher before she went into this. So she's always been a teacher her whole life. She taught elementary school, she taught at Wiley College. Now she's teaching employers and employees how to get along and follow the laws. And so much of my material is from this newspaper article. Also at that time, her husband, Carnis Salisbury, who has a master's degree at this point, is chief of social work at the Public Health Service Hospital in Fort Defiance, Arizona. He's coming home almost every weekend to be with Carnis back in Albuquerque. And this is in the 70s, and when she's working at the EEOC. This picture is from that time frame. Now, Carnis is continuing to live in Albuquerque. She lived here for 50 years, remember, from 61 to 2011. And she loved plants. So I believe this picture is from the backyard of the house on Manzano Street, based on the backyard wall. It looks like a house from that neighborhood. And it's got a giant yucca in the background. the state flower. And this is a photo of Oliver and Carnis Salisbury at that same house, I believe, in Manzano, with that red brick tapped wall in the background. And I've been told that Oliver loved to take photos. So he would take lots of photos of Carnis, but sometimes he would be in the photos as well. Later on in life, Carnis Salisbury, Oliver Salisbury dies in 1993. I should make a point. And then after that point, she was ready to make a big change in her life. She was ready to move out of that house on Manzano Street and move to the west side. It's one of the trailblazing people to settle the West Mesa of Albuquerque. And she moves to what is still a fairly new subdivision at that point, the La Luz townhomes right off of Coors. The Montaña Bridge hadn't even been built by then. So she's moving out to the growing edge of town because she always was willing to try new things, take risks. Oliver Salisbury, her husband, had died in 1993. And also I should mention too, throughout these decades of activism in Albuquerque, she was very active with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She had served as the president of the State of New Mexico chapter of the NAACP, and during her busy career with the federal government. She was a fundraiser for their telethon, the Freedom Spectacular. And the Freedom Spectacular telethon in New Mexico was so successful, they made more money than any of the other state chapters in the country. And this led to a humorous incident of where the NAACP says, oh, just send us all the money you made at the Freedom Spectacular telethon, and we'll send back the State of New Mexico chapter's share. And Carnis is like, no, we have certified public accountants that are active in our organization. We'll figure out what the national office's share is and send the national office the national share, and the state chapter will retain its portion. And then Oliver worked it out between the two of them so everybody had their share. The national office had their share and the state chapter had their share for the good work that they were doing. So that showed that Carnis, even though New Mexico was a small state at that time, and still we're a relatively small state by population compared to the other states in the Union, she was able to raise a lot of money. She knew who needed to talk to. Louis Armstrong was performing in the Freedom Spectacular, and she knew how to get people to contribute to the cause of social justice and the work that she was doing, the very important work she was doing with the NAACP. And so, moving along here, yes, in the 1990s, she moves to the house at 3 Tumbleweed Street Northwest out at La Luz Townhomes. And she's honored in the 1990s with the Living Treasure Award from the city of Albuquerque for her lifetime of public service. As part of being named a living legend by the city of Albuquerque, well, the first living legend in Albuquerque, her portrait is put up at the Albuquerque Convention Center. And also a portrait is displayed in the office of U.S. Senator Jeff Bingaman. She receives an award from the NAACP in 2006 for her longevity and activism with the NAACP. And she's invited to be that guest speaker in 2009 at that fair housing law training class that we just watched. She was the opening plenary speaker for a room full of lawyers, myself included. And then in 1999, she's profiled by the Albuquerque Journal and Sage magazine. They write a profile about her life because she has done so many incredible things. And at that point, she's 84 years old in this picture. And she had moved to Albuquerque in '61, and she'd helped get that fair housing law passed in the 60s. She continued on being an inspiration to many people, doing decades of civil rights work. And at this point, usually in your 80s, people are winding down their careers, but not Carnis. She's learning to become a mediator. Like I said, she went to graduate from high school, graduate from college, went to get her theology degree. And then here she is in her 80s, having worked at the EEOC and done all these other things, led the NAACP at the statewide level. And she's becoming a mediator now in her 80s. And she's volunteering to serve as a mediator to help resolve disputes between people. So she's always trying to achieve change in the world through higher education and reducing ignorance in people and helping to educate people and help them see there's a better way to live in harmony and in peace with their neighbors. And also the neighbors on Manzano Street eventually did like the Salisburys. When they first moved there, some of the neighbors put up paper over the windows and foil. They didn't want to look at the African-American family next door. But by the time the Salisburys were ready to move out, they'd made peace with the neighbors, and there was peace on Manzano Street. Finally, Carnis Salisbury passes in 2011. But before we get to that, I should mention when she was facing her last illness in December 2011, she was a patient at Presbyterian Hospital here in Albuquerque on Central Avenue. And her husband, Oliver, had been a patient at that very same hospital back in 1993. The Salisburys were always very generous and thankful to the people that took care of Oliver Salisbury in his final illness on the 7th floor of Presbyterian Hospital. They nicknamed it Seventh Heaven. And after he passed, they wrote a beautiful thank you note, a plaque that they presented to Presbyterian Hospital that the hospital hung in the hallway there on the 7th floor, saying that the Salisburys are very grateful to the good medical care that was provided them at the Presbyterian Hospital in 1993. In 2011, when Carnis was having her last illness, she was also on the 7th floor of Presbyterian Hospital, right near that same plaque. The good work that she had provided, all that gratitude, that lifetime of gratitude to people that were helping to advance the cause of caring for people, was being returned to her. It had come full circle. Now she was the patient in the hospital where previously she'd been the visitor. She had built up Albuquerque her whole life, sharing love and caring for other people and equal opportunity. Now the hospital was there to take care of her. So she eventually did pass at the Anna Caseman Hospital and there on December 23rd, 2011. She'd been in hospice care there for a few days. And after she died, a funeral was held in her memory at Trinity United Methodist Church here in Albuquerque. Trinity United Methodist Church existed from the 1950s until at least 2012 when this occurred. It was a small church, and the congregation has since shut down. At that time, it was a very well-attended service. The sanctuary was packed. And it was presided over by the Reverend Lourdes Calderon, a woman. And again, remember, Carnis had been breaking ground by going to study theology, one of the first female graduates from the school she had gone to in Atlanta. So Carnis was always supportive of the Methodist Church ordaining women. So it was fitting that a woman pastor would preside over her service at her memorial at the end, because she believed in equal opportunity, men and women in all professions. And she ended up being buried right next to the love of her life, her World War II veteran husband, First Lieutenant Oliver Salisbury at Santa Fe National Cemetery. And again, Carnis Hightower Salisbury, born January 1st, 1914, died December 23rd, 2011, right before her birthday on New Year's Day. Now we're going to watch a few silent slideshow of photos from the family funeral. If you'd like to listen to beautiful testimonies about the life and times of Carnis Salisbury, and also some stories about Oliver Salisbury, please watch her whole funeral. It was videotaped, professionally edited, and posted on YouTube. And so the funeral is more than an hour, however, so we're just going to watch a few minutes of just the slideshow at the end. The slideshow is right towards the end of that hour, more than an hour into the service. There'll be a brief pause while I change screens here. And so we can see here Carnis Salisbury, that early childhood photo, growing up in Texas, one of many siblings. She always thought of other people. She was not an only child. Carnis Hightower, as a young woman, the elementary school teacher in Texas, in a small town, but she wanted more. She would go to college in Atlanta. And she would marry Oliver Salisbury, the love of her life, and follow him to DC. She was always very active and engaged in the community, and had a loving family. She had two daughters, Olivia and Patricia, and she would stay in touch with her family out of state as well and go to family reunions. She's always engaged with people. She loved people and loved the community, many friends. And I believe this is the backyard of the house at 924 Manzano Street with the red brick around the backyard. She loved plants, I hear. And so again, here's one of those beautiful yucca plants. And you can see a lush greenery in the backyard. And then, blooming flowers. You can see she kept in touch with all of her siblings. And she always liked to have young people around. She loved to teach. good times at the family gatherings at her home. And she was blessed to know many people. And Oliver was always there by her whole life, his whole life long, from the 40s through till 1993. And even after her husband, Mr. Oliver Salisbury, died in 1993, she kept engaging with the community. Some people withdraw from life when they become a widow, but not Carnis. She continued to engage in life and engage in church, engage in education, engage in community activism and social justice work. I believe the red carnations are the tradition for church on Mother's Day. Yes, and as we can see here, the slideshow continues on. If you'd like to see the full version, please check it out on the YouTube video of her funeral. It starts around 1 hour and 20 minutes. The whole video from the funeral is 1 hour and 40 minutes. So we're going to stop the share here and continue on with our presentation. Now, the Carnis's death had an impact in Albuquerque. It left a hole in the community in some ways. It was the loss of a leader. She had been active in the NAACP, State of New Mexico chapter, and Albuquerque chapter for decades. And she'd also been an active member of Trinity United Methodist Church her whole life in Albuquerque. And so after she left, it represented the ending of an era there at Trinity. The membership continued to dwindle, and she'd been one of those active lifelong members, a lifelong Methodist. And so the Trinity UMC is a good example of how when you have someone who's been a lifelong member of an organization and they're no longer there, things change. The congregation had dwindled and dwindled, and eventually the congregation shut down. Trinity United Methodist Church building became vacant and was sold to local realtor Chris Pino, who was unable to successfully redevelop it. Unfortunately, the building still remains vacant to this day. Mr. Pino wasn't able to develop it the way Carnis had been able to keep it as a thriving congregation. Eventually, Mayor Tim Keller had to red tag the building on June 26, 2018 as a substandard building. The building suffered 3 fires that year. But at the same time, Carnis's death, her value has been passed on to the next generation of the family. Her daughter, Patricia Salisbury, still lives here in Albuquerque to this day. I would like to thank Patricia Salisbury for much of the information in this presentation. She provided a great deal of resources to me. Thank you, Patricia. And she continues active as a teacher in her own right with the Albuquerque Public School District, I believe. I know she served as a transit advisory board member because I've ridden the bus with Patricia Salisbury before. We've ridden the Albuquerque Rapid Transit, the art bus together on Central. And so the legacy of community service, community engagement, fighting for justice continues on for her children and all the other lives she touched, all those people she talked, all those many years. A little bit about the organization Albuquerque Housing Authority, AHA. Albuquerque Housing Authority is a municipal public housing authority, a PHA, funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development HUD. So we're not the federal government, we just receive funds from the federal government. We're actually a branch of the city, we're a city subsidiary. Albuquerque Housing Authority is governed by the Board of Housing Commissioners, which is created by the City of Albuquerque adopting City Council Resolution 2010-97, which is signed into law by Mayor Richard J. Berry. And the mission of Albuquerque Housing Authority is to provide affordable housing and self-sufficiency opportunities. Albuquerque Housing Authority exists to provide affordable places to live in our city for our residents and to provide opportunities for jobs and income so people can eventually afford to buy their own house, just like the Salisburys. And so after Mrs. Salisbury had passed, the Albuquerque Housing Authority building was named in her memory to honor her memory and everything that she stood for and she wants to continue to see occur in Albuquerque. The mayor of the city of Albuquerque, Richard J. Berry, asked the Albuquerque Housing Authority Board to approve Resolution 2013 to name the building after her. And the board approved that idea unanimously in a board meeting on January 16, 2013. I helped write Resolution 2013-01. I also helped write Resolution 2010-97 to create the Board of Housing Commissioners in the first place and make us a public body corporate here at Albuquerque Housing Authority. I'm proud to be part of this effort. And so Albuquerque Housing Authority's main office building at 1840 University Boulevard was then renamed the Carnis Salisbury Building on February 19, 2013. I'm giving this presentation from my office inside the Carnis Salisbury Building. And because this was an official action of the city of Albuquerque through the Albuquerque Housing Authority, the city's television station GovTV followed Mayor Berry over here when he did the naming ceremony on February 19, 2013. So we're now going to see the video of Mayor Berry dedicating the building in the memory of Carnis Salisbury, and her family will speak as well. It's a very moving little video, and it's about 16 minutes long. And this video is available on YouTube to watch anytime. And then after we watch the video, we'll wrap this up and I'll take questions.
I just want to thank everybody for coming out today. This is a special day, and we're paying tribute to a special lady and a special gentleman that did a lot of things for our city. And before I get started, I just want to thank Dr. Bailey for working with us on this. He worked with Doug Lutz. Doug's here. Where's Doug? Doug Lutz here is my Director of Constituent Services, and Dr. Bailey and I sat down about a year ago and started talking about making today a reality. And sort of Robin Otten and Doug Chaplin and everybody at Family and Community Services, all the folks here at the Housing Authority, thank you so much for making today possible. February is Black History Month. We all know that. So it's appropriate that today that we're here to honor an outstanding African-American woman who pioneered fair housing in the city of Albuquerque. Mrs. Carnis Salisbury graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree from Wiley College in Marshall, Texas. She was a teacher. She was the Dean of Women at Sam Houston University, highly accomplished. She received her master's degree in theology from the Gammon Theological Institute in Atlanta, Georgia. Carnis worked in state and federal governments in Washington, D.C., and right here in our hometown of Albuquerque. She had a history of working with equal employment opportunity commissions and related organizations concerned about equal rights for all people. Carnis was known for her directness, her tenacity, her determination, and her steadfastness. She was a longtime civil rights activist. She was a community leader, and she was a living treasure to many who knew her. And if you could just look at her photograph there, and you can see the spirit even in the photograph. It's just amazing. And her beautiful daughters are with us today, and I know we're going to have them speak on behalf of Carnis today. In the 1960s, I was born in 1962, but in the 1960s, Carnis, along with her husband of 51 years, Oliver Salisbury, worked together to achieve fair housing legislation here in Albuquerque. And although Oliver's name is not on the building today, we acknowledge his courage to stand up for the right of all citizens of Albuquerque to live where they choose. Let me say that again. It seems odd today that we'd have to have a sentence that said the right to live where you choose. And it's because of Carnis and Oliver that many of those rights are in place today. I'd also like to note that Carnis Salisbury received the City of Albuquerque's Human Rights Award in 1990 to recognize her outstanding contributions and her achievements. There's a documented history of discrimination against certain groups of people as stated in restrictive covenants contained in real estate contracts. There was a time in Albuquerque when an African-American family could not purchase a home in certain neighborhoods even if they had the financial resources to do so. Carnis and Oliver Salisbury thought that was wrong, and they were right, and they worked hard throughout their lives to change that discriminatory practice. Carnis Salisbury was a civil rights pioneer. She was a champion of the African American community and a pillar for justice in the eyes of many. The name of Carnis Salisbury on the City of Albuquerque's Housing Authority building will be a right tribute as a constant reminder that she was an advocate for civil rights, she was an advocate for human dignity, and she was an advocate for fair housing. And I'm proud to be the mayor of Albuquerque during this significant dedication of the Carnis Salisbury building. I know we have a lot of friends and a lot of family here. We were having some discussions earlier. A lot of you folks obviously knew Carnis and Oliver personally. I want to thank you for coming today. Many good friends here with us today. I want to turn it now over to Patricia Salisbury, who's Carnis's eldest daughter, to share her thoughts. And at that point, we'll have Dr. Bailey come up and speak as well as Linda Bridge. And then we'll have some closing remarks, and then we'll reveal the sign on this beautiful building. So please help me welcome Patricia Salisbury.
Thank you, Mayor Barry, and the other dignitaries from the city of Albuquerque. And I want to thank all of our friends that are here, our many friends that we've made in Albuquerque. Thank you for being here. I'd like to recognize the other members of my family who are here and have them stand. My sister, Olivia Salisbury. My cousin, Carnis Hightower. My nephew and his wife, Sean and Sharon Harris. Wave your hands because you're already standing. Okay, thank you. For as long as I can remember, my parents were involved in housing. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and we never lived alone, ever. We lived in a house, but we always had other people in our house, people that couldn't stay other places, like truckers who were on the move, who had to have a place to stay during their runs. So we had truckers, different ones staying at our house at different times. We had black women that stayed in our house over the weekends. They lived with white families and worked in white homes during the week, but they wanted to come to the neighborhood and be at home on the weekends. So my parents were always interested in providing housing to those people who were not able to find housing easily. When they moved to Albuquerque in 1961, my dad was in the hospital at the VA, and my mother was just out here. We didn't know we were going to have to move to Albuquerque. It turned out we did. And so my mother and father set about trying to find us a place to live. Well, I grew up very middle class. I'm a middle class black kid from DC. And we wanted to maintain our standard of living. And my parents soon found out that African Americans weren't shown houses outside of the South Broadway area or the Kirtland Addition. And a professor from UNM happened to be selling his home in the university area himself, not through a realtor. And he agreed to sell my parents a house at 924 Manzano Northeast, near San Mateo and Constitution. Well, my family paid the down payment, all ready to move in. All the neighbors, we learned, sent a petition around the neighborhood to ask that we not move there. And in fact, a group of the neighbors came over and offered my mom and dad the price of the house not to move there. Well, we moved there anyway. When we moved in, the neighbors on both sides put newspaper and paper bags on over the windows facing our backyard so they wouldn't have to look at us. So that was our introduction. That was our welcome to Albuquerque. But as years went on, I have to tell you, when that man died next door, after about, what, how many years, Livy? 30, 40. His wife asked my dad to be one of the pallbearers. They had become friends. And you know, this happens when people get to know other people. And it took a lot. I don't know if I would have been able to do that. But my parents stood there. People got to know them. The neighborhood got to know us. And in fact, the Albuquerque community really got to know something about what African Americans are like. I want to thank the city for this acknowledgement, this honor. I am so sure, I'm really sure that Mom and Daddy are really happy today. Thank you.
I think Carnis and Oliver may be with us today.
I think they are.
Patricia, that's a sad and interesting and wonderful story all at the same time. And you really hit a key point. It's one of the things that Albuquerque is becoming known for, and it's one of the things that we should be the most proud of, and that is, you know, we're a place now that celebrates rather than tolerates diversity. And the best way to get people together is get them to know each other. It's pretty hard to hate somebody that you know. And so those are great words today. Thank you for sharing those with us, and thanks again for all that your mom and your dad did for our community. Next, I want to bring up just a good friend of mine, Harold Bailey, Dr. Bailey. A lot of you here know Dr. Bailey for his role in the African American Affairs Department in the state government. That's where Dr. Bailey and I got to know each other. I was a state legislator. I was on the Appropriations and Finance Committee. Dr. Bailey was in charge of African American Affairs. His budget was part of my budget work that I did, and I just I gained a lot of respect, and I gained a mentor and a friend out of that process. And so now he's with the NAACP, and they're in good hands with him in charge in the state of New Mexico. And I'd like to have Dr. Bailey come up and share a few thoughts with us as well. And we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Dr. Bailey, I'll tell you that.
Appreciate it, buddy. All right, thanks, Mayor. Thank you, Mayor. It's just a couple things I wanted to say. First of all, I'd like to thank Mayor Berry for his support. It probably wouldn't have become a reality without his backing. I just want to thank the Salisbury family for sharing your parents with us. One thing I would like to say, as far as Ms. Salisbury and Mr. Oliver Salisbury, they did very important things 50 years ago. So I think the young people, not too young, but the young people should realize, what are we going to do to carry on this struggle? I know it's Black History Month, but it's no time to take a vacation or have a party, because the movement continues, and it's a very important day. Every time we drive by here, we'll see Carnis Salisbury's name up here, and I'm just happy to be a part of this particular celebration. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Harold. Next, I'd like to bring up our housing authority, the head of our housing authority, Miss Linda Bridge. She's got a few comments that she'd like to make as well, and then we'll get on with the business of officially showing you the letters on the building here. So, Linda, nice to see you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. On January 16, 2013, the Albuquerque Housing Authority Board of Commissioners passed a resolution, of which the last line stated that the Albuquerque Housing Authority Administrative Office Building at 1840 University Boulevard Southeast, Albuquerque, New Mexico, shall now be known as the Carnis Salisbury Building. And I'd like to present the family with a copy of that resolution. I just want to state how very proud I am of that action taken on behalf of our Board of Commissioners to name our building after this incredible woman, and how fortunate I am to have been able to learn about Carnis Salisbury. I think we're very fortunate as a city to have Mr. and Mrs. Salisbury in our history books, and we're a better city as a result of that. I would like to recognize our Board of Commissioners, two of which could be here with us today. We have with us Mr. Stephen Vogel and Mrs. Rebecca Chavez. Not with us today is Janet McHart and Roxanne Rivera-Wiest. I'd also like to recognize the hardworking staff here at the Albuquerque Housing Authority, if you guys can all wave. These are the folks that work tirelessly every day to continue to try to provide those housing services to those most in need here in Albuquerque. And with Mrs. Salisbury's name on our building, it'll inspire us to continue that work that we do every day to make sure those that are most in need have access to housing. And we just want to thank you for the education we've received about Mrs. Salisbury, and thank you for allowing us to put her name on our building.
Thanks, Linda. Thank you. Linda is our new director of the Housing Authority, and one of the things that we've been working on for several years when we took over the administration was we wanted to start a housing authority. We wanted to give it some autonomy. So I want to thank our housing authority board members. Several of these folks are folks that I handpicked. I said this is one of the really important things I want to do. We picked the cream of the crop, and they're getting things moving, but they wouldn't be getting things moving without the great employees. So I do want to echo what Linda said. This is important work. It's important work to a lot of people. This affects families and a lot of folks around Albuquerque. So once again, thanks to all the employees that do such great work on behalf of the city of Albuquerque. With that, let's give these fellows a break. Their arms are going to get tired. Patricia, you want to come up here and why don't you count it down for your mom here?
Okay, and one thing I forgot to say when I was introducing family.
Yep. Please.
My mom was Harold's mother-in-law.
Oh, no kidding.
I'm sorry.
And he still wants to honor her. That's amazing. That's amazing. All right, count it down.
5,
4,
4, 3, 2, 1.
So this is a recent picture of the Carnis Salisbury building. The south entrance is the main entrance to the Albuquerque Housing Authority's headquarters at 1840 University Boulevard Southeast. And that's where we have the prominent naming letters there, Carnis Salisbury building. The name Carnis Salisbury is actually in larger font and bigger font than the Housing Authority's own name. We honor Carnis Salisbury by giving her top billing. And Mrs. Salisbury is remembered in the Albuquerque Housing Authority office lobby by having her portrait shine under a shining light up at the pinnacle of the lobby. Her eyes gaze out upon everyone that gathers in the lobby. And there's a plaque to go along with the picture. And Mrs. Salisbury and Mr. Oliver Salisbury as well leave a legacy of civil rights. They're civil rights pioneers here in Albuquerque. Mrs. Carnis Salisbury worked her whole life to help people overcome ignorance, racial discrimination and segregation in housing and employment. She seeks to affirmatively further fair housing opportunities, AFFH, as we say in the housing industry, affirmatively further fair housing, which means not just to prohibit discrimination, but to affirmatively seek to overcome a legacy of discrimination in America's history and in Albuquerque's history. She sought to support equal employment opportunities for all people. Both men and women, people of all racial backgrounds, national origins, all that sort of stuff. And together, Carnis and Oliver Salisbury worked together to lead the way forward to changing laws in our city of Albuquerque, the groundbreaking Civil Rights Ordinance, years before the federal government did it. And they supported national efforts through the NAACP and other organizations to achieve change at the federal level. And also by serving on state boards like the State Human Rights Board and serving on the national board of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. And Carnis, even into her 80s, helped educate people, serving as a mediator, helping to reconcile people together. She even educated people like me, local attorneys that attended a fair housing law training class and agreed to have it filmed so that way she could continue to train people, even those that didn't attend the class in person. And she wanted her story to be told long after she was gone on how to help enforce those laws to ensure that there was equal justice under law for everyone, and that would be a reality in our city. And tying into that thought of the lessons of the past and the Salisburys, The lessons and values that Oliver and Carnis Salisbury taught Albuquerqueans in their lives are now leading to changes in local law here in Albuquerque in 2021, state law in the state of New Mexico, and federal law at the national level. You may not be aware that the City of Albuquerque Human Rights Ordinance that started in 1963, that law that Carnis and Oliver worked together to ban discrimination in the sale of housing on the basis of race, that has been updated in 2021 by the City Council adopting an ordinance amendment to ban discrimination on the basis of race in the form of hair, crown, the Crown Act, creating a respectful and open world for natural hair. The Crown Act amendments at the city level protect folks that have race-based related hairstyles, such as braids, afros, tight coils, bantu knots, and twists. So you can't refuse to rent an apartment to someone because the lady comes up and she's got twists in her hair or tight coils. You can't refuse to rent a house or an apartment or refuse to sell a house to someone based on their cultural headdress. If the home buyer is wearing a hijab, that would be discrimination on the basis of religion or national origin. That's prohibited. Head wraps and headscarves are also, you can't discriminate on that basis under the Crown Act. Another headdress is for someone's personal, cultural, or religious beliefs. Those are all protected things. I think Carnis would approve of this amendment to the original Human Rights Ordinance that they pushed through in 1963. It's extending that whole idea of no discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity or religion. The state of New Mexico then adopted the Crown Act, creating a respectful and open world for natural hair during the 2021 legislative session. So state law this summer now will protect people in job interviews when applying to rent or buy a house or get a home mortgage loan. And it was part of a team effort. Many people, if you click on the link, you can learn more. And now federal law, just past week, President Joe Biden, after signed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act on June 17th to declare June 19th and annually a new federal holiday to commemorate the end of slavery in the United States, a Freedom Day, a day to celebrate freedom and equality. And the Salisburys would be familiar with this because of their deep roots in Texas. And this has been, that's where the historical events for Juneteenth come from. And so that is my presentation on the life and times of Mrs. Carnis Salisbury and her husband, Mr. Oliver Salisbury, fair housing and civil rights pioneers here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I see we have a couple of questions in the chat. Let's see. Oh, well, question number one, Janet Sayers asked, does Wiley College still exist? Yes, I looked online at the website of Wiley College as part of my research for this presentation, and Wiley College is still going strong after this pandemic. And so they exist in Texas, and I encourage you all to visit their website to read the history of the college. They have a nice page on their website that goes into detail about the history of Wiley College. Patricia Salisbury writes in to say, I'm pleased that the work and accomplishments of the mother are being recognized by the Historical Society today. Black History Matters. I fully agree. And Terry Christensen writes in, he got the GI Bill, question mark? I would assume he did, but I'd have to go back and double check. But I can say he did go to Howard University in Washington, D.C., and he earned a degree there. And I'd have to double check to see if he got the GI Bill or not. But I think he might have. Patricia would know for sure. Janet Sayers asks, did Carnis ever run for public office, elected office? It seems like she would have been a good Bernalillo County Commissioner, Albuquerque City Councilor, or school board member. As far as I'm aware of, Mrs. Carnis Salisbury never ran for elected office, but she certainly was qualified, more than qualified, to be a school board member, or a city councilor, or a county commissioner. I think she preferred working more behind the scenes, helping to run the organizations that she was so passionate about, being the statewide chapter president for the NAACP, serving in appointed roles on the State Human Rights Board and on the national board of the EEOC. That would be plenty for anybody. And also being a mediator in her 80s. I mean, she had a full life, even though she wasn't an elected office holder. The Albuquerque alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated wants to share that. Thank you for this wonderful presentation on our dear member's family. She was definitely a force to be reckoned with. Her daughters, Patricia and Olivia, are also members of our organization. Wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. I would like to also recognize Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated for attending the memorial service for Mrs. Carnis Salisbury. If you watch the video of her memorial, at one point in the video, they have all the sisters stand up in the church, and they packed the house. There were multiple pews there. So that is a lifelong sisterhood for sure. And Janet Sears also mentions that many African Americans came as educators in New Mexico in the 50s and 60s to pursue the job opportunities that were available here, because there were more teaching positions available to them than in the still segregated South in the 1950s and 60s. That's true. Lots of people came to work in public schools and the university from all over the country. And then, my friend Nancy Scheffelbein writes that it's an excellent presentation and every child in Albuquerque Public Schools should be familiar with Mrs. Salisbury. Wholeheartedly agree. And then the folks at Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated asked, did Patricia Salisbury and Olivia Salisbury have an equally difficult time while they were at Highland High School in the 1960s? That is outside my interviews with Patricia, so I direct you to ask Patricia Salisbury directly. I didn't go into too much depth, but what Patricia did mention was it was difficult in terms of culture shock, because she was just one of 2 African American students in the class of 1964. So I think there's probably some more information there if you want to ask Patricia. I think she might be willing to share. But with that, if people have additional questions, please feel free to write in. The questions are being forwarded to me by Mr. Dan Jones, our information technology coordinator, through the Facebook Live presentation, and I received them on the Zoom chat. So there is like a couple minute delay as they're going from one platform to the other. But I really appreciate everyone that's watching this presentation live today on Father's Day, June 20th, 2021, June 20, 2021. And I encourage you all to share the story of Mrs. Salisbury online with your friends and family and others. If there are any teachers out there, please share this with your students. Any real estate brokers out there, please share this with your colleagues in the real estate industry. And the big takeaway lesson here is that Mrs. Carnis Salisbury is an Albuquerque fair housing and civil rights pioneer. And she worked her whole life to make sure that people had opportunities for equal housing in Albuquerque and in New Mexico and all across the country, all across the USA, that people should be free from discrimination in where they live, that people should have the right to buy a home wherever they want to. If they can afford it, they should be able to buy it. Or if they want to rent, they should be able to sign the lease and rent the place if they can afford to pay for it. She sought to overcome ignorance, racial discrimination, and segregation, and to firmly further fair housing opportunities and equal employment opportunities for all people. And she was an effective community organizer, raising record amounts of money for the NAACP. She was a dedicated woman of faith, being an observant Christian her whole life. And you can even see that in her speech in 2009 to the fair housing law training class that I attended. She talked about how it was ungodly. So her values really drove her whole life. She stayed true to what she believed in. And know that Mrs. Salisbury had a great impact in Albuquerque, and her lifelong legacy continues through the work that she did, all the people she educated, all the people she inspired, myself even, and also through her daughters, Patricia and Olivia. Also, I'd like to thank her friend, Hannah Best, who's also a lawyer, who made herself available for an interview and contributed information to this presentation. And I'd like to thank all the different authors that we quoted in this article, and the video providers, and everyone that's made this presentation possible. I'd like to thank the Albuquerque Historical Society for allowing me to be their honored guest speaker today. And with that, since I see no other questions, I will conclude the presentation. Thank you so much.